welcome. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I thank you for participating in the Transit Asset Management Principles for Small Systems webinar. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. I am going to introduce Scott and Bob, our presenters. Scott Baker is a Senior Consulting Manager with AECOM. He has extensive experience in investment planning for major transportation systems, business process improvements, strategic, operational, and information technology systems, organizational assessment and review, financial planning for transportation entities, and innovative contracting. Mr. Baker has a combination of national consulting experience on major transit issues and hands-on experience based on years of line responsibility for operations and asset management at San Antonio's Via Metropolitan Transit and Pittsburgh's Port Authority of Allegheny County. Robert Brownstein is a Vice President at AECOM and a Senior Consulting Manager in the Transportation Consulting practice. He is an internationally recognized transit expert with over 38 years' experience in the public transportation industry. He has particular expertise in project development, information technology, maintenance, operations, procurement, and materials management. Prior to joining the private sector, Mr. Brownstein was senior official with the New Jersey Transit Corporation. In addition to financial and capital program-related positions, he served for 10 years as the Director of Procurement, responsible for purchasing, contract administration, materials management, and distribution.
I'd like to just go over the structure of the series. I don't think we've covered it yet. For those who may have tuned in today and haven't tuned in before, this is a series of 2, and we did the introduction on June 13th. Today, tomorrow, and the next day, we're doing 3 versions of what you'll see today for small agencies, and then tomorrow for larger bus agencies, and Thursday for agencies with rail. The role that Southwest played will be a different and representative agency each day. I hope that the Southwest Transit presentation was useful. I think Dave Jacobson and his crew give you a real immediate hands-on feel for what implementing asset management is like, and you'll hear echoes of their presentation throughout the presentation that Bob Brownstein and I are going to do the rest of this session this afternoon. The goal is very simply to increase the understanding of asset management and establish a recognition of its value to transit. We're going to be talking about definitions, then basic asset management principles. We'll briefly review benefits of transit asset management. We're going to describe the pre-MAP 21 FTA policies for asset protection. This is a webinar that's designed around good business practices, not designed around the rapidly emerging FTA policies. If you saw the first series on the 13th, you got the latest information there is from FTA on their MAP 21 requirements. But we'll touch on the pre-MAP 21 policies and then introduce strategies to develop and implement asset management at your system. This second of the series of 2 is going to focus on the 10 steps in building an asset management plan, and then we'll touch on a few asset management tools and techniques after the focus on the 10-step plan method. The definitions in asset management, I think, are important because so much of this stuff we've been doing in the industry for a long time, and we present it using the International Infrastructure Management Manual, which is a good comprehensive manual that represents international global thinking on asset management theory. But once you get the definitions in mind and understand what the scope is we're talking about, I think you can fit the pieces of what you know from your transit operations into the definitions and start to fill in some of the missing pieces from this global practice of asset management that we're going to be discussing. The first definition on this slide is one we developed for this course, which says that asset management focuses on business and engineering processes for resource allocation and utilization. So it's making good decisions using business and engineering processes, and some of that will become clear as we go through the slides. The second definition is from MAP 21. It says that asset management is actions that will achieve and sustain a desired state of good repair over the life cycle of the assets at minimum practicable cost. And you'll hear that theme of minimizing the life cycle cost of the assets in the slides. And then the International Infrastructure Management Manual, which, as I've said, is a source of a lot of the information in the course, defines asset management as the methods of meeting a required level of service in the most cost-effective manner through management of assets for present and future customers. So it echoes the theme of cost-effectiveness and minimizing cost, but kind of ties a bow on it with the customer reference. We should say we're talking about physical assets, including software IT assets, not financial assets. You've already heard in the MAP 21 definition the term state of good repair, which is sometimes used synonymously but really means a condition of assets as opposed to the process of managing them. And you'll hear us talk about EAM or enterprise asset management systems, or sometimes even maintenance systems interchangeably to describe the software solutions that support the collection and analysis of data for our systems throughout the industry today. The asset management plan, you'll be hearing our version of the asset management plan based on the International Infrastructure Management Manual, similar to the one that you heard Southwest Transit describe. But that's not to say it's necessarily what FTA will define in their requirements. And then the capital investment plan, which is your planned capital expenditures, and the renewal and replacement expenditures then form part of your asset management plan. So there's an overlap between capital investment plan and asset management plan. The principles of asset management we went over in the first of the webinar series are that they're policy-driven from the governing board usually down, performance-based based on what the assets are doing, how reliable they are, that you evaluate options to do trade-offs and evaluate trade-offs between alternative courses of action to make a decision. It's all data-driven and relies very heavily on the collection of data that you trust and that's comprehensive, and you saw that in the Southwest Transit presentation. And it's transparent in the sense, and this is where I think there's substantial room for improvement in the practices in the U.S. industry. It's transparent in the sense that you can take your service objectives and base the analysis on the service objectives and the performance data and cost data to derive the minimum cost method of providing your assets, so that the replacement decisions and the maintenance program decisions can be traced analytically directly back to the targeted service level and the data that you've collected. How can it help? It can reduce long-term costs for asset preservation. That's clear from the objectives stated in the definition of minimizing the life cycle cost of the asset. It can provide more consistent performance since you're managing the assets and the data and monitoring their performance and their reliability, but you can manage that reliability and achieve greater consistency over time. And the same with safety. You're monitoring the assets, the safety data, you're managing the replacement and maintenance of those assets and can assure greater safety over time, or more consistent safety over time. All in all, better decision making, more transparency, improved ability to make the case for funding because of that transparency and to respond to funding fluctuations and plan for them, and to take into account risks that the agency faces in technology, costs, and in the condition of its assets.
There are 10 steps in building an asset management plan. I think the steps are very important because asset management is a process, and coming up with the plan is that process. And what we'll do is we're going to quickly try to go through the plan. So during the course of this part of the webinar, we're going to identify the main components of a asset management plan, identify the different roles involved in implementing the plan, and what you need to do to begin to first implement that plan. What's required for implementation? First of all, it needs strong executive support. The reason why is asset management is a change. It's a very different approach to how many of the transit agencies have been conducting business, and it affects virtually all aspects of the way the agency does business. So it's about change, and you need strong, consistent executive support to be able to do it. It needs to become part of the culture. It is a cultural change. You need buy-in from managers and staff at all levels. It is not just the responsibility of the IT department or the finance department or operations or maintenance. It involves all of them. And if it involves all of them, they need to be all on the same page and moving in the same direction. There needs to be a willingness to assess the current condition and improve. Oftentimes, or a lot of times, agencies sometimes are reluctant to have that sort of information collected or made available. This is about a willingness to look at your assets, identify what your assets are, and assess the condition of your assets so that you can make improvements. It's an interdisciplinary perspective. Again, it involves all aspects of the organization. The data is looked at and used differently by different parts of the organization, in which case it's interdisciplinary. And it's sustained. It's a multi-year commitment. You don't want to go ahead and spend a lot of money collecting data and then not doing anything with that data or not keeping that data up to date, because if you don't keep it up to date and you want to maintain an asset management plan, you're going to have to go in and recollect that data, and initially it could be a very time-consuming and expensive process. The other thing about sustained multi-year commitment is that there are decisions that go into what data you're collecting. And there needs to be forethought in terms of how you're going to use that data and whether or not that level of detail is important for what you want to do in asset management. On the right, there is a chart that's titled Asset is a Risk-Based Approach. And as we go on, you'll see that asset management and managing the asset is very much a risk-based approach. And in order to make those decisions, good current data is very important. So how do we start? Where do we begin? Well, what this chart shows is that you try to begin with a very core program and over time mature that program. So the core program consists of preliminary inventory, that is collecting some of the most critical data that you can use in order to be able to start. And then over time you could go ahead and add more information on those assets and mature the system. So preliminary inventory, setting up a life cycle approach, that is that look at your assets as life cycle as opposed to I'm going out and buying a bus and it ends there. No, it doesn't end there. It is I'm buying a bus and how am I going to maintain that coach over its life cycle, and when am I going to replace that coach, and what are the performance requirements going to be relative to how that coach is going to enable me to provide service to my passengers. It's core asset management plans using best available information, and then evaluate trade-offs using simple criteria. Again, trade-offs go to the question of risk. So if you have an objective in your performance requirements not to release a coach if there is hypothetically 10 light bulbs on the interior of the coach, then that's a performance criteria that you set for that coach. If maintaining a coach you want to invest to ensure that all your lights are working, then that's another trade-off that you're making, and that's an investment. And then over time, go to a more advanced program, long-term life cycle plans that optimize cost and risk. Strategies, goals, performance measurements are all consistent and aligned. IT systems are integrated and understood. There is not one single asset management computer system. In most cases, what it is a series of systems that are highly integrated that are exchanging data back and forth. And then the strategies are all risk-based. The process for building an asset management plan, we mentioned 10 steps. These are the 10 steps of building a plan. The first step is develop the asset inventory. That is find out what you have. That is your data collection, your initial data collection on what your assets are. The next step in that is the asset condition. So you're evaluating your assets and you're determining the condition of those assets. Again, there's a level of detail you're collecting on the condition of the assets. In the earlier presentation, there was a reference made to establishing a condition assessment on the asset of 1 to 5. So you can do that, or you can get into a finer level of detail on the asset condition. Determine residual life. How much life is left in your assets? How long will it last? Step 4 is determine life cycle and replacement costs. Step 5 is service targets. So if you have a service target of increasing your mean distance between failure on your coaches, improving that performance to hypothetically 8,000 miles on mean distance between failure on a coach, that's a service target. That is a target that you're going to want to achieve. And what is the investment going to take to accomplish that? Do you replace your rolling stock at a higher rate? Do you apply more maintenance? What is the cost? And then you assess risks associated with, and that goes to optimizing the O&M expenditures and then optimizing the capital investment. The next step is step 9, determine funding strategy, and then the last step is to document the management plan. The process for this is showing the 10 steps in another form. This is the process for building the plan. You develop the asset inventory, you assess the condition. These 1 through 4 are answering the question, what is the current state of my assets? What is the current condition? What is the residual life on those assets? What are those assets? And what is the life cycle and replacement cost? The next question that is answered is, what is the required quality level of service? That is set to service targets. Question 3 is, what are the assets are critical to sustain performance, assessing the risk. So a bus obviously is critical to sustain performance on meeting your quality service target. So keeping that bus in service, that's assessing the risk on that asset. The next question is, what is the best maintenance and capital investment strategies, optimizing O&M and optimizing capital investment. And then the last question, question 5, is what is a long-term best financial resource allocation strategy? That's funding and then the ultimate asset management plan.
We'd like to spend a few seconds talking about each of the 10 steps, and Bob and I are going to continue handing the conversation back and forth. So starting with the inventory-based steps, the first step is to develop the inventory. In reality, what we find and what the Southwest presentation illustrated is many folks are developing 2 inventories, and we'll see how that progresses, but they clearly had an inventory for their dossier system that they were using for maintenance management, and they've now developed the access database that they described for capital planning in their presentation. Ideally, people will be able to tie these inventories together with automated links, but the technology is honestly still progressing there. It's important to have all of the assets in an inventory that's used for both maintenance and for capital planning so that you have maintenance and capital plans for all of your assets. Traditionally, in capital planning in the industry, many agencies have done a call for projects. People bring forth renewal and replacement projects among the capital projects. And if you ask the question, do we know if these are all the projects that should be considered, there's no way of answering the question. If the program is inventory-based, that is, if you have a complete list of the assets, you can go through that list and answer the question, are there other assets that should be renewed and replaced? Southwest alluded to the question of deciding what should be in the inventory, and this is one of the tougher questions you'll face. I think they've done the right thing by just saying, okay, we're going to start. The question really is how granular, how fine should the inventory be, particularly if you're doing a separate inventory for capital purposes or trying to roll up a maintenance inventory for capital assets, you're going to need to decide what is kept in the capital planning database, and it should be based on how you're going to make the decisions. The assets should be in there that need to be renewed, that need to be replaced, and that should guide the granularity of the capital asset inventory. We have here an example from Washington State, which has done asset management plans throughout the state and has defined the assets in the inventory as all rolling stock, regardless of cost, facilities with a replacement value of $25,000 or more, and any other equipment with a replacement value of $100,000 or more. So that's the way they outlined their inventory levels. What should be in the inventory? The basic items, a description of the asset, year manufactured or placed in service, remaining useful life, replacement cost, an important addition that Southwest talked about, future financial requirements, risks associated with the assets, and its location. And location, I think, turns out to be quite useful. Here's an example of a manual asset inventory form showing some of the aspects that we'll be talking about recorded, such as condition, replacement cost, residual life, and so forth. And here's an automated inventory example. Again, similar to the one that Southwest had developed in-house for their capital planning. The second step is to assess the condition of the assets. You heard Southwest mention that that had turned out to be surprisingly useful to them. It's not something that we've traditionally done in the industry. We've talked about age as a substitute for condition. We often talk about what's the average age of a fleet, or we talk about the age of facilities. But we need to go beyond that to manage the assets, to talk about the condition that may be unexpected due to hard usage, due to heavy duty cycles, or may be unexpectedly good due to light usage and lighter duty cycles, or just good luck with technology. But the other attributes of condition include the maintenance expense. Is it trending more and more expensive to maintain, and how rapidly more expensive? Field inspection can give you a source of condition assessment, and availability and performance data. What are the miles between road calls? How often is it down? How much of the time is the asset available for use? So those are four typical aspects of condition assessment. Here you see a condition measurement example that was actually developed by the Industry State of Good Repair Roundtable, convened by FTA for several successive years. And you'll see the four aspects we mentioned in the four columns: asset age, asset condition, which means physically observed condition, the performance, and the level of maintenance. And this measurement of age suggests that you should assign a score to each asset from 1 to 5, 5 being new in terms of age, no visible defects in terms of physically observed condition, or exceeds all performance and reliability metrics in terms of performance, no unfunded maintenance in terms of maintenance. And 1 point would mean it's past its useful life in terms of age, all the way over to a significant backlog of maintenance in terms of maintenance. So each of these scores for each asset are then weighted by the weighting at the bottom of the screen: 20% on age, 30% on physically observed condition, 30% on asset performance, and 20% on level of maintenance, and added together to come up with a weighted average score for the example here of 2.70. You'll also see on the right an index that FDA has been using in its National Conditions and Performance Report of a state of good repair, constituting a score of 2.5. A major use of this asset condition rating system like this is to combine assets together and talk about large asset groups and their average condition. I want to stress there's no magic to this particular format. I don't know whether Southwest used this format or not. We tend to see 5-point scales used a lot. Washington State, whom I just mentioned, uses a 100-point scale, so a totally different method of rating. But the objective is for you to maintain information in your inventory that shows for each asset the condition in a way that is useful to you in planning the maintenance and replacement of that asset. Bob's going to talk about residual life.
Before I get into that, I think it's important to again note that we're talking about asset management. It's a good business practice. It is something that, although FTA is now moving in the direction of requirements relative to MAP 21, it is a good business practice. It enables an agency to make good investment decisions and good O&M decisions and tie those decisions directly to service performance requirements. So it's a good business practice. And I think one of the questions that came up, reading them on the side, a question came up asking about do you collect the data on the asset before you decide what your performance requirements are? And frankly, you decide your performance requirements independent necessarily of the data you're collecting. You're collecting data on the condition of your asset, and then you're looking at what is it going to take in order to accomplish the performance requirements that you've set for your organization, your performance targets. You then could decide, after having done that, whether or not the investment of accomplishing those targets is too great. Or you can decide, no, it makes sense to do so, and you'll continue that investment. So, now going back to residual life. Once an agency understands the conditions of its assets, it could determine future needs by estimating remaining life, and that's what this chart shows. First of all, the bars over here show the failure rates, and as you can see, years in service, the bars go up. And then the replacement period is a 2-year period, and it's based on your failure rate that you've set as a target is when you're going to do your replacements. So you can see here the replacements begin at year 9 and it runs for a 2-year period ending at year 11 in order to achieve a certain performance target. So once an agency understands the conditions of an asset, it can determine what its future needs are by estimating remaining service life. Determine life cycle and replacement costs. This slide needs to relate again to the designed service quality levels that you want to achieve. So the initial capital cost is what it takes to purchase the equipment. The initial capital cost would also include the design of that equipment, any cost associated with replacing that equipment. One of the interesting things that come out of that is theoretically you can pay more money for a higher quality equipment or higher quality construction and get a better service performance out of that asset. Or you can spend less and possibly get less service performance out of that asset. So there's a direct correlation between the initial capital cost and the service. Then the next is future maintenance costs. There are systems out there which track costs in maintenance, which plan maintenance, which help you determine when you need maintenance on that equipment, on that building. This is where you would determine what it would cost in order to provide maintenance over the life cycle. Then there's rehabilitation costs, replacement costs, and used to determine the optimum life. So what maintenance activities, what actions do you take, and how much do you spend to achieve the optimum life on the asset? Step 4 is determining life cycle and replacement costs. Replacement costs includes, as I said earlier, all costs the transit agency will bear, including soft costs, which includes design and so on. The replacement costs can be determined by current costs or original purchase / construction costs adjusted for replacement during operations, technology changes, full or partial replacement, and then ADA, regulatory requirement. These factors go into the decision on proceeding to make a replacement. So if you want to keep current with technology, your replacement might be sooner. If there's regulatory changes, anticipate ADA and so on, your replacement might be sooner, and so on. So there are other aspects that go into your decision to replace. Complete the asset inventory. So the asset inventory provides a solid foundation to these questions. And these questions will go forward in terms of telling you what your assets are, what you need to maintain, what you need to replace, what you need to rehab, and what do you use in order to provide service. So what do I own? What condition is it in, and how well does it perform? What risks are associated with it? How long will it last? How much will it cost to replace, and what are the future financial requirements? And keep inventory current and active. So there's the initial investment to determine your asset and the condition and so on, and then there's the maintenance of it. Now, what some agencies have done is, instead of going there and counting, these are the larger agencies doing a complete 100% asset inventory, what they might do is do a sample of some of their assets and then project that to the remaining assets, and over time bring in the additional information in the systems.
So we've done the inventory. In response to one of the questions that came in, we don't have to do these things exactly in this sequence, but I think there is a logic to saying first figure out what you have. A next and very different step is setting the quality of service targets. It's an important aspect of this method in that the quality of service targets become the basis for all of your maintenance decisions. So the quality of service targets address how well we want the assets to perform. That probably the most generic measure of quality of service is the availability of the asset. How much of the time is it available? But traditional transit measures like miles between road calls, on-time performance are also typical quality of service target measures. The next step is assessing risk, and the important aspect of risk is to ensure that you take it into account. And we'll show an example of a risk assessment process. It's not the only way to take risk into account in your asset management plan, but you should be thinking about the criticality of the assets, which ones are most critical, which ones have the greatest potential to disrupt service or to impose unusual costs, which fits right into your normal risk management and insurance process. And it can take the form of maintaining data on each individual asset. And here's an example of where that's done. This example actually comes from Dallas area rapid transit. Most of the risk measures that you'll see have the two dimensions that you see here, degree of impact across the top of the slide and the likelihood of occurrence on the left-hand margin. And combining those two allow you to assess the combined risk for any asset. In this case, the asset is rated 4D, meaning that it has a substantial risk of incurring low cost to the system. This is a relatively sophisticated method of assessing risk at the upper end of the scale that you might want to tackle. So the basis of any maintenance program is the preventive maintenance interval. Those of you who have been involved in maintenance for a while will recognize that principle. The corrective maintenance, which is most of the rest of the maintenance program, is determined in a sense by the preventive maintenance program because it relates to the failures that have not been prevented by the preventive program. So this slide shows a key principle in asset management of setting the preventive maintenance interval. The horizontal axis on this slide is the interval. It could be considered in months, in thousands of miles, whatever unit you want. The point is that over time, we know that the cost of preventive maintenance to the system goes down directly according to the extension of the maintenance interval. So this blue line indicates the declining costs of preventive maintenance as you extend the interval longer and longer. The dotted gold line shows the increasing cost of corrective maintenance and the consequences of corrective maintenance on service and the operations, which constitutes the risk exposure from failures. So the risk exposure from failures goes up more and more as you proceed over time. there is a point at which you reach a minimum combined cost of preventive maintenance and corrective maintenance. And by adding these two cost curves together, you derive the gray curve on top, which is the total cost of the asset relative to the interval that you set for preventive maintenance. And there's an optimum point where the dotted line is shown. So this is a way of showing the preventive maintenance interval, which results in the lowest life cycle cost of the asset, combining both preventive and corrective maintenance. And we'll treat the capital element separately. The capital program is the renewal and replacement program. The life cycle costs include the maintenance costs, the operating costs that are affected by capital, the rehabilitation costs for renewing assets, rebuilding vehicles, and the replacement costs for replacing the vehicle. This is an example of a life cycle cost computation comparing light-duty and heavy-duty buses. It's the cumulative operating and capital costs over time, and it's derived from the actual data of an operating transit system. So a major message here is we often think we don't have enough data to do analysis like we were showing to optimize the maintenance interval. In fact, we do have this data, and this data convinced the system that its light-duty bus both cost less to maintain and had a total life cycle cost that was less than the heavy-duty bus. We don't represent this as a universal analysis. It's dependent on the duty cycle of the particular system, the vehicles involved, but for this system, they had data in their maintenance system when they pulled it out and analyzed it that convinced them that the life cycle cost of the one bus was lower than the other. And with that, I'll hand it over to Bob to talk about funding strategy.
Determining funding strategy. What do the systems need, and how will funding be allocated to meet those needs? And if funding is sufficient, how are limited funds best invested? There have been recent examples where the federal government where FTA looked at agencies and said, no, we're not going to give you money for expansion. What you need to do is spend money on reinvestment. Your existing system needs reinvestment. So it's critical that there be a balance. And in some cases, what FTA did was enforce that there was a balance. So how will fundings be allocated to meet those needs? What an asset management plan and system will do will provide you with the information that you need in order to determine how those funds can best be allocated. Do you proceed to replace your overaged equipment? Do you proceed to add a new light rail line, and which is more important, which is the best investment? And this will enable you to make informed investment decisions. It will also enable you to explain those decisions to the public, to your boards, to the politicians, and so on, because the decisions will have been made on hard information and will be informed decisions. If funding is insufficient, how will be invested? To trade-offs. Do you divert funding from expansion to reinvestment? Balancing the funding, including fares with annualized life cycle cost and operations. Again, going back to the O&M cost and the investment in O&M to ensure that the equipment is in good condition and meeting the service targets. This system will enable you to determine what happens to conditions at current funding levels and what funding levels are required in order to maintain state of good repair. So how much money do you need to continue to reinvest in your system to achieve a state of good repair of your system, and should those investments precede those on system expansion? Again, the asset management plans will enable you to make informed decisions in that regard. What we're going to discuss is documenting the asset management plan itself. So what we've done is we've gone through the 10 steps, and the documenting of the plan is basically the steps you've gone through and what you've experienced in the process and what you've done in those steps. So details include background, description, current and targeted conditions, program descriptions, financial requirements and funding strategies. Again, as Scott pointed out earlier, very important, the performance metrics and the commitments to the users to achieve those metrics. So the plan itself is documenting what you've done.
Briefly on the organizational aspects of implementing asset management, this slide illustrates an example asset management team. Southwest Transit folks commented they had a very small team, so this already lists more people than they probably have in top management and on their asset management team. But the functions that you want to make sure are involved are finance, information services, customer services, strategic planning, safety, and service delivery, and this suggests some outside advisors can be helpful. Here are some titles that you'll often see in transit related to those functions. The functions derive from the international practice of asset management that we've described, and these are some of the titles that you'll see in the transit industry. Southwest Transit mentioned beginning with a pilot building, and clearly a pilot group of assets, a building, a subfleet. If you have more than one operating base would make sense in terms of introducing the asset management methods that we've been talking about. And you need to think about improving your asset management process over time. This slide shows a typical plan, kind of cycle with assessing the current practices, researching industry best practice, identifying the gaps, deciding on the improvements you want to make, and then hopefully an independent outside review or even audit of the process to feed into the next cycle of improving your asset management processes. So to summarize this asset management planning process, if you focus on your current practices and develop a more advanced level over time using a cycle like the preceding slide, you can work into more sophisticated asset management step by step. Secondly, you need upper-level management support to undertake this process. Clearly, it cuts across functions, and the organization, like Southwest Transit, has to decide as an organization to undertake it, and you can evaluate and adjust the plans as necessary. And Bob is going to begin the summary of our webinar.
Points to walk away with. What is asset management? Well, it's comprehensive documentation of how you manage your assets over the life cycle of those assets. It's inventory, condition, performance, and plan. How can it help you? It helps you lower cost. It helps you achieve consistent performance. It helps you assure safety. It's better decision making. Transparency. It provides credibility for funding, and it enables you to manage your risk. What is required for implementation? Strong support from executive management. Buy-in, a willingness to assess current conditions. It's an interdisciplinary approach. Scott showed you earlier a slide which had a number of different organizations involved in the process. Well, it is an interdisciplinary approach, and it requires sustained commitment. How can you get started? Well, you get started now potentially with a pilot. You conduct a preliminary inventory. You set up a life cycle approach with a core plan, identifying what trade-offs are going to be required in order to achieve that.
So we'll go back to the principles. The policy-driven from the top of the organization, performance-based, based on your results. That you evaluate options, as we saw, different maintenance intervals, different replacement timing and useful life, that you have data that you trust to do it with, and that you use analysis that results in a decision that's transparent in the sense that it's based on the data and the analysis. So Bob summarized, and we've gone over the ways that asset management can help you. We've talked a lot about what's required for implementation, and I think we've given you some ideas about how to get started and move forward. I think the best suggestion in that regard is to look at what Southwest Transit has accomplished with a small staff and a fairly short period of time just through focusing on asset management. We have on the last slide a number of resources. If you're interested in reading up on asset management, the second to the last is the International Infrastructure Management Manual, which this material is somewhat based on. The FDA site has a number of good resources. In particular, I'd recommend the second group there, the State of Good Repair Roundtable documents that give you lots of presentations from transit agencies on their asset management programs. And the last resource, the guidelines for the application of asset management in a railway infrastructure organization, is interesting because many of the other theories of asset management talk about infrastructure generally. This railway guide is the one that directly addresses an operating industry that is not largely capital intensive. So it's not highways, water, power. It's a transportation industry with a high labor intensity and equipment component like transit.